You send a message, and then you send 3 more right after it, adding context, softening the tone, making sure nobody misreads you. You answer a simple question at work with a 5-minute explanation nobody asked for. You justify why you left early, why you said no, why you chose this instead of that, even when no one demanded a reason. This happens quietly, every day, in small conversations most people never think twice about. It feels like politeness. It feels like being thorough. But underneath is something else entirely. A slow erosion of how people see you and how you see yourself. Before we go further, if you find value in this message, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this channel grow, and it helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. Number 1, the silent cost of justifying yourself to everyone. Every time you explain yourself to someone who has not asked for an explanation, you're quietly telling them that your decision requires their approval before it can stand. This is not what you mean to communicate, but it is what gets received. People do not remember the content of your explanation. They remember the posture behind it. A person reaching for permission rather than a person simply acting. Over time, this posture becomes your default setting in every interaction, and the people around you start to expect it, then start to demand it because you have taught them, without meaning to, that your choices are always open for negotiation. The Stoics were extremely precise about this dynamic, even though they never used modern words like authority or social capital. Epictetus taught that some things are within our control and some things are not. Our judgments, our choices, our actions, these are ours. The opinions of others about those choices are not ours and were never meant to be managed by us. When you over-explain, you are quietly trying to manage something that was never within your control to begin with, another person's perception. This is not humility. It is a subtle form of anxiety dressed up as courtesy, and it drains energy that could have gone toward the actual decision itself. Consider how this plays out in ordinary situations. A manager announces a decision and then spends the next 10 minutes defending it, point by point, to a room that had not even questioned it yet. A parent tells a child no and then unpacks 5 reasons why, as if the child's approval is required for the no to hold. A friend declines an invitation and then sends 2 follow-up messages, making sure nobody is upset. In each case, the explanation was not requested. It was volunteered out of a discomfort with simply letting the decision stand on its own. This discomfort is worth naming directly because it rarely gets named. It is the discomfort of being disliked, misunderstood, or judged, even briefly, by people whose judgment may not even matter. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not for an audience, which is exactly why his words carry such weight. He reminded himself repeatedly that other people's approval adds nothing to the truth of a matter. If your decision was sound, it remains sound whether or not someone else understands your reasoning. If your decision was unsound, no amount of explaining will fix that. Only better judgment will. This means explanation, in most everyday cases, is doing no real work at all, is not improving the decision. It is only trying to manage the emotional discomfort of being seen as someone who might be wrong, or difficult, or selfish. There is a cost to this that compounds silently over months and years. Each unnecessary explanation is a small transaction where you spend credibility to purchase temporary comfort. You feel better for a moment because you have smoothed things over, softened the blow, made sure everyone understands your reasoning. But the person on the other end absorbs a different lesson, that your word alone is not enough, that your decisions need scaffolding, that you're someone who needs to justify rather than someone who simply is. This lesson gets reinforced every time you explain what did not need explaining, until it becomes the water you swim in without noticing. None of this means you should stop communicating clearly or stop being considerate of others. Stoicism does not ask you to become cold or dismissive. It asks you to notice the difference between explanation that serves clarity and explanation that serves anxiety. A brief, honest statement of your position is not the same as an extended defense of your right to hold that position. The first is communication. The second is a quiet request for permission you never needed to ask for. And every time you ask for it, you hand away a small piece of the authority you're trying so hard to protect. Number 2, why explanation signals weakness. There's a strange belief many people carry, often without examining it, that more words make a position more solid. If a little explanation makes something clearer, then surely a lot of explanation makes it airtight. This belief is almost the exact opposite of how authority actually works in practice. The people whose word carries the most weight in any room are rarely the ones talking the longest. They are the ones whose brief statements are trusted precisely because they are not padded with defense. Length, in most human interactions, does not read as confidence. It reads as need, the need to be believed, the need to be understood, the need for the listener to sign off before the speaker can feel settled. Seneca wrote extensively about the discipline of restraint, not just in action, but in speech. He observed that a person who has done the necessary internal work rarely feels the urge to prove themselves out loud, because the proof already lives inside their own judgment. The urge to keep explaining is often a signal that the internal case has not fully been made to oneself yet. If you were entirely settled in your own reasoning, you would not need the other person to also be settled in it. Their agreement would be irrelevant to your peace of mind. The moment you find yourself reaching for a third or fourth explanation, it is worth asking honestly whether you're trying to convince them or trying to convince yourself. This shows up clearly in leadership contexts, though it is not limited to them. A leader who announces a difficult decision and then stops, allowing silence to exist after the statement, communicates something entirely different from a leader who fills that silence with justification. The first leader signals that the decision was made with care and does not require external validation to remain valid. The second leader, often unintentionally, signals doubt. People are extremely sensitive to this signal, even when they cannot name it. They begin to sense that decisions here are negotiable if enough pressure or pushback is applied, because the leader has shown, through the sheer volume of explanation, that their own certainty is thin. This same pattern damages personal relationships in quieter, more painful ways. When you constantly explain your feelings, your boundaries, your reasons for needing space or saying no, you're not making those things more valid. You're making them feel more fragile, both to the other person and to yourself. A boundary that requires 5 paragraphs of justification starts to feel like a request rather than a boundary. A feeling that needs constant defending starts to feel less like truth and more like an opinion up for debate. The Stoic principle at work here is simple but demanding. Your inner state does not need outside verification to be real. It is real because it is yours, and it remains real whether or not anyone else agrees with it or understands it. There's also a practical, almost tactical dimension to this that the Stoics understood well, even though they framed it in terms of virtue rather than strategy. People instinctively probe for weakness in any exchange, not always out of malice, but simply because that is how negotiation, debate, and social dynamics work. Over-explanation is one of the clearest weaknesses a person can display, because it shows exactly where the pressure points are. Anyone who wants to manipulate you, guilt you, or push back against a decision now knows precisely which threads to pull, because you have already shown them, through your own words, where your uncertainty lives. The discipline being asked for here is not silence for its own sake, and it is not coldness. It is the discipline of saying what is true, plainly, and then trusting that truth to stand without a support structure built out of anxious words. This is far harder than it sounds, because it requires tolerating the discomfort of being possibly misunderstood, possibly disliked, possibly judged unfairly, and choosing not to chase after that discomfort with more words. The Stoics called this tolerance a form of courage. It is the courage to let your position exist in the world without following it around, apologizing for its presence. Number 3, command your own judgment, not others' approval. At the center of Stoic philosophy sits a single, demanding distinction. Some things are up to us and some things are not. Our own judgments, choices, desires, and actions are up to us. Everything external, including what other people think, say, or feel about us, is not up to us. Epictetus opens his entire body of teaching with this distinction because he understood it as the root of both freedom and inner strength. Over-explaining yourself is, in almost every case, an attempt to control something in the second category using tools that only work on the first. You cannot make someone understand you through sheer volume of words if they are committed to misunderstanding you, and yet the habit persists because it feels like doing something is better than doing nothing. This is where the Stoic idea of the dichotomy of control becomes not just a philosophical curiosity, but a genuinely practical tool. When you notice the urge to explain yourself further, the question worth asking is simple. Is this explanation adding information the other person actually needs to act correctly, or is it an attempt to manage their opinion of me? These are two very different purposes, even when they look identical from the outside. The first is legitimate communication. The second is an attempt to control the uncontrollable, and every attempt to control what is not within your power ends the same way, with frustration, exhaustion, and a quiet sense of having lost ground you did not need to lose in the first place. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire and surrounded by people who constantly needed things from him, wrote to himself about not wasting energy on trying to be understood by everyone. He noted that it is enough to act well, according to your own nature and your own reasoned judgment, and to let that be sufficient. This was not arrogance. It was, in fact, the opposite of arrogance, a recognition that his job was to act rightly, not to manage the internal narrative running inside every other person's head. That narrative belongs to them. Trying to author it for them through constant explanation is trying to write words in a book you do not own and were never given the pen for. This distinction becomes even more important once you notice how much energy over-explaining actually consumes. Every justification requires you to anticipate objections, rehearse defenses, and monitor the other person's reaction in real time to see if you have said enough yet. This is cognitively and emotionally expensive, and it is expense spent entirely on something outside your control. The Stoics were, among other things, deeply practical about energy. Seneca often wrote about the mind as something with limited resources that must be spent wisely, and he considered the chase for external approval one of the most wasteful expenditures a person could make, precisely because the goal itself can never be fully reached. There will always be someone who does not understand or does not agree, no matter how much you explain. Letting go of a need for approval does not mean becoming indifferent to other people, and this distinction matters because it is often misunderstood. The Stoics were deeply engaged with duty, relationships, and community. What they rejected was not connection with others, but dependence on others' opinions for your own internal stability. You can care about someone's feelings, take their perspective seriously, and still not require their approval in order to feel settled in your own choice. These are separable things, even though modern habits of communication often blend them together until they feel identical. Separating them again is much of the work being described here. What emerges from this distinction, practiced consistently, is a kind of quiet solidity that other people notice even when they cannot articulate why. A person who has stopped chasing approval through explanation begins to carry their decisions differently. Not defensively, not aggressively, but simply as facts about how they have chosen to act. This solidity is what authority actually is, stripped of titles or positions. It is the visible evidence that a person's center of gravity lives inside their own judgment, and not in the shifting opinions of whoever happens to be in a room. Number 4, how over-explaining feeds anxiety and erodes self-trust. There's a feedback loop hidden inside the habit of over-explaining that most people never notice because it operates quietly and feels, in the moment, like the opposite of what it actually is. Each time you offer an explanation nobody required, you are implicitly telling yourself that your original statement was not enough on its own. This message gets absorbed by your own mind just as much as by the listeners. Over months and years, this repeated message trains you to distrust your own plain statements, your own decisions, your own boundaries, because you have practiced again and again, treating them as incomplete until backed by justification. This is where over-explaining stops being simply a communication habit and becomes a genuine psychological pattern with real costs. Anxiety often does not announce itself directly. It hides inside behaviors that look responsible or considered on the surface. The person who explains everything 3 times over is rarely aware that what they're doing is managing an internal fear, the fear of being misjudged, the fear of conflict, the fear of disappointing someone. The explanation feels like problem solving, but it is actually a coping mechanism for discomfort that has never been addressed directly. The Stoics would say this discomfort deserves examination in itself, rather than being soothed indirectly through more and more words aimed at other people. Marcus Aurelius frequently reminded himself that most of what disturbs us is not the event itself, but our judgment about the event. Applied here, the disturbance is rarely the other person's potential disapproval. It is our own internal judgment that their disapproval would mean something catastrophic about us, that we would be exposed as wrong, foolish, or unworthy of respect. Over-explaining is an attempt to prevent that imagined catastrophe from occurring. But the catastrophe was never realistic to begin with, and chasing its prevention through endless justification only confirms, deep down, that some part of you believes the catastrophe is plausible. This belief is worth questioning directly rather than managing indirectly. There's also a slower, more corrosive effect at play, one that touches self-trust specifically. Trusting yourself means being able to make a decision and let it stand, checking in with your own reasoning rather than immediately outsourcing verification to everyone around you. Each time you over-explain, you're quietly asking an external party to confirm that your decision was acceptable. Do this often enough, across enough decisions, and you begin to lose the internal muscle required to simply know that you made a reasonable choice. You start needing other people's reactions the way some people need a mirror, not occasionally, but constantly, just to know that you are still standing where you think you're standing. This erosion rarely gets noticed until it becomes severe because each individual instance feels small and reasonable. One explanation here, one justification there. None of it feels alarming in isolation. But the cumulative effect, over years, is a person who has quietly trained themselves to need external permission before feeling settled in almost anything. This is precisely the opposite of what the Stoics considered a well-ordered inner life. Epictetus taught that the goal was to become, in his words, unhindered and free, meaning free from the requirement that external events or opinions align with your wishes before you can feel at peace. Over-explaining is the daily practice of the opposite condition, a life where peace is always pending someone else's verdict. Breaking this pattern requires a specific kind of honesty that is uncomfortable at first. It means noticing the exact moment the urge to add one more explanation arises, and pausing there instead of following the urge. In that pause is where the real work of Stoic practice happens. Not in grand moments of philosophical reflection, but in the small, repeated choice to let a statement stand without chasing it with reassurance. Each time this pause is chosen instead of the habitual explanation, self-trust gets a small deposit instead of a small withdrawal. Over time, these deposits accumulate into something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like quiet authority. Number 5, building authority through silence, action, and discipline. Authority, in the way the Stoics understood it, was never about volume, position, or persuasive skill. It was about the visible alignment between a person's judgment, their words, and their actions. When these three things are consistent, a person's presence carries weight without needing to be argued for. When they are inconsistent, when words constantly chase after actions, explaining and re-explaining and softening, that weight dissolves, no matter how articulate the explanations happen to be. Rebuilding authority, then, is not primarily a communication project. It is a discipline project, one that starts with cleaning up the gap between what you decide and what you feel compelled to justify afterward. The first practical step in this discipline is learning to let statements stand alone. This means, in ordinary conversation, saying what is true and then stopping, resisting the pull to add 3 more sentences of context that nobody requested. This will feel unnatural at first, even rude, because the habit of softening every statement with explanation has likely been practiced for years. But this discomfort is exactly the discomfort the Stoics ask their students to sit with deliberately, understanding that growth in any discipline requires tolerating the unfamiliar feeling of doing something correctly for the first time. Sitting in that silence after a plain statement is, in a very real sense, a form of Stoic training. The second step involves examining your own reasoning privately before ever speaking, so that your confidence in a decision comes from your own scrutiny rather than from the reactions of others. Seneca often recommended a kind of nightly self-examination, reviewing the day's choices honestly, asking where reasoning was sound and where it slipped. This practice builds something that no amount of external explaining ever could: a genuine, tested confidence in your own judgment, earned through private reflection rather than public defense. When this confidence exists, the urge to explain yourself to others naturally quiets, because the verification you were seeking from them has already been supplied by yourself. The third step is learning to separate care for another person's feelings from a need for their approval of your decision. You can tell someone plainly and kindly what you have decided and why, once without circling back to check whether they now feel comfortable with it. This is not coldness. It is respect. Respect for their capacity to process information and reach their own conclusions without you managing that process for them. The Stoics considered this kind of respect a form of justice, one of their core virtues, because it treats the other person as a rational agent capable of handling truth rather than someone who must be carefully managed into agreement. The fourth step is accepting, deliberately and repeatedly, that some people will misunderstand you regardless of how much you explain, and that this misunderstanding does not require fixing. Marcus Aurelius wrote about encountering difficult, unreasonable, and unfair people almost daily, and his response was not to explain himself more thoroughly to them. It was to act rightly according to his own judgment and let their reaction belong entirely to them. This acceptance is not resignation. It is a redirection of energy away from something outside your control and back toward the only thing that was ever truly yours to manage: your own conduct, your own reasoning, your own next action. What results from consistently practicing these steps is not loudness, dominance, or coldness toward others. It is a quiet, settled steadiness that other people notice without being able to fully explain why. This steadiness is what real authority has always been made of, long before modern ideas about confidence and communication style existed. It is built one unexplained decision at a time, one resisted urge to justify at a time, one night of honest self-review at a time. The Stoics did not promise this would be easy. They promised it would be worth doing, because the alternative, a life spent explaining yourself into smaller and smaller versions of your own convictions, was never a life of freedom to begin with. Every idea in this video points back to the same simple truth. Authority was never built through more words. It was built through the quiet consistency between what you decide, what you say, and what you do. The moment you feel the pull to explain yourself for the third or fourth time, that pull is worth noticing rather than obeying. It is not a sign that you need to say more. It is a sign that some part of you is still looking outside yourself for permission that was never required in the first place. The Stoics did not ask their students to become distant or unkind. They asked them to stop confusing consideration for others with dependence on their approval. You can be warm, honest, and plain in what you say, and still refuse to chase your own words with endless justification. This is not a personality change. It is a daily practice, repeated one conversation at a time, one resisted urge at a time, until it becomes simply how you carry yourself. None of this happens overnight, and it is not meant to. What changes first is small and internal. A slightly longer pause before speaking, a decision left to stand without a follow-up message, a boundary stated once instead of defended 5 times. What changes later, almost without you noticing, is how people begin to receive you. Not because you demanded respect, but because you stopped spending it on explanations nobody asked for. That is where real authority quietly begins. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing for more practical Stoic philosophy applied to everyday life.